Lee was on death row for another murder, but was also serving a separate life sentence for the second-degree murder of Geraldine Barr DeSoto, who was killed in Addis but was a Simpsport native.
The reaction to any death, it's tragic.
Derrick Todd Lee, a death row inmate tried in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, died of heart disease in a hospital in 2016 instead of on the lethal injection table as his sentence stipulated. From 1998 to 2003, he brutally murdered at least 7 women, spreading terror throughout Baton Rouge and Lafayette. Posing as a homeless man asking for help, Lee infiltrated the safest of homes, turning them into stages for bloody nightmares. Meanwhile, the police were busy hunting a non-existent white man, leaving Lee, a black man, free to prey on his victims. Today, we reopen the file on this shocking case, exploring the journey of one of America's most dangerous serial killers from his first crime to the secrets he took to his grave. Due to the serious nature of the content, viewer discretion is advised. On a July night in 2002, Diane Alexander heard a knock on her door. When she opened it, she saw a black man who claimed to be homeless and was asking for help. But as soon as she opened the door, the man brutally attacked her. Miraculously, Diane survived. She is the only woman to have escaped the clutches of Derrick Todd Lee. But why was she so lucky? And how did a small detail from this attack become the key to breaking the entire case? Remember, the car that Diane's son saw it will become extremely important later in this story. And there is something remarkable. Throughout this time, police conducted thousands of DNA tests on white men in the area. They were completely unaware that the killer they were searching for had an entirely different skin color. To understand the evil that Derrick Todd Lee perpetrated, we need to know about the women whose lives he took. Each victim had her own life, her own dreams and loved ones waiting for her to come home. Geraldine DeSoto, 21, was a young woman full of energy and dreams. On January 14, 2002, she was preparing for a new life. At the same time, not far away, Derrick Todd Lee was planning his next attack. Charlotte Murray Pace, 22, was a graduate student at Louisiana State University. She was writing her thesis and had a bright future ahead of her. But on May 31, 2002, her life was brutally cut short. Randy May Brewer, Gina Green, Pam Keenamore, Trinesha Colombe, and Carrie Yoder. Each name represents a life stolen too soon. And while the victims were living their final days, Lee was perfecting his increasingly sophisticated method of murder. But there was a detail about these victims that not even their families knew, a mysterious connection that helped police realize they were dealing with a serial killer. Derrick Todd Lee was born on November 5, 1968, and from a young age he exhibited unusual behavior. Before becoming a murderer, Lee had been arrested for stalking women and peeping into their private homes. This was a red flag that many criminal psychologists have recognized. According to criminal psychologists, stalking and voyeurism are often the first developmental steps for predators. It allows them to study their victims, understand their routines, and plan their attacks in detail. Notably, Lee had an average IQ of only 65, a score that is on the threshold of what is considered an intellectual disability. However, he showed surprising sophistication in planning and executing his crimes. This is a paradox that experts are still debating. There are 5 warning signs that everyone should know about potential predators: repeated stalking, observing private homes, constantly changing stories, a lack of empathy, and a history of violence against women. Lee exhibited all of these signs. What made Lee particularly dangerous was his constantly changing modus operandi. He did not follow a fixed pattern, which caused the police to take a very long time to realize they were dealing with a serial killer. However, there were common features that appeared in most of the cases. Lee always took the victim's cell phone. This was a way to prevent them from calling for help, and also a strategy to avoid being traced. Another notable point is that there were no signs of forced entry at the scenes. This indicates that Lee was very adept at getting his victims to voluntarily open the door. One of Lee's classic methods was to pose as a homeless person knocking on doors asking for help. This was a sophisticated psychological strategy. Most people are inclined to help those who appear to be in need. Lee exploited human kindness to commit his crimes. 2 bodies were found at the Whiskey Bay boat launch about 30 miles west of Baton Rouge, right off Interstate 10. The choice of this location was not random. It allowed Lee easy access and escape from the scene. This was one of the biggest investigative blunders in American criminal history. Based on an inaccurate FBI criminal profile and misleading witness testimony, the police believed the killer was a white man. They conducted thousands of DNA tests on white men in the area, while the real killer, a black man, was still roaming free. The investigation had reached a dead end. There were no leads, no suspects. In desperation, the police decided to seek help from DNA Print Genomics, a company specializing in DNA analysis to determine racial ancestry. The results of the analysis completely changed the direction of the investigation. DNA Print Genomics determined that the suspect had 85% African genes. This was a major turning point for the first time police knew they were looking for a black man. More detailed analysis of the DNA found under Geraldine DeSoto's fingernails led to the identification of Lee as the primary suspect in the murder of the 21-year-old in Addis, Louisiana. On July 9, 2002, Lee broke into Diane Alexander's home in St. Martin Parish. He beat her brutally and attempted to rape her. But Diane Alexander was lucky enough to become Derrick Todd Lee's only survivor. What saved Diane was that her son walked into the house just as Lee was committing the crime. Lee panicked and fled through the back door. Diane's son chased after him and managed to get a description of the car. This is the very car I mentioned at the beginning of this story. Diane was able to provide a detailed description of Lee's appearance. On May 22, 2003, she worked with a sketch artist to create a composite sketch of the suspect. Combined with DNA evidence from the deceased victims, the psychological profile created by Mary Ellen O'Toole, and the sketch based on Alexander's description, the police decided to release the information to the public. Interestingly, police in the nearby town of Zachary recognized the man in the sketch. They had recently investigated a Peeping Tom case, and the suspect had an identical appearance. The Zachary police contacted Baton Rouge and provided the suspect's name. Not only that, but they also had Lee's DNA sample from a previous murder investigation 6 to 8 months earlier. When compared, the DNA samples were a perfect match. Derrick Todd Lee was finally exposed. Once Lee was identified as the prime suspect, law enforcement tracked him down and arrested him in Atlanta, Georgia. Lee waived his right to an extradition hearing and was returned to Baton Rouge to stand trial. The first trial took place in August 2004 for the murder of Geraldine DeSoto. DeSoto had been found dead in her Addis home, stabbed multiple times. Initially, DeSoto's husband was a prime suspect, but as the investigation progressed, DNA evidence pointed to Lee as the real culprit. Although Lee was eligible to be charged with first-degree murder, the prosecutor decided to charge him with second-degree murder because DeSoto was not sexually assaulted, which would have made a first-degree murder conviction more difficult. Lee was found guilty by the jury and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was some debate about whether Derrick Lee was competent to stand trial. In psychiatric evaluations, he had an average IQ score of 65 on various standardized tests. A score below 69 is considered the threshold for intellectual disability. However, Lee was still deemed competent to stand trial despite his low IQ. This was a controversial decision, as many argued that with such an IQ, Lee might not fully understand the legal proceedings he was undergoing. The paradox is that despite his low IQ, Lee demonstrated a considerable level of sophistication in carrying out his crimes. He could plan in detail evade capture for a long time and change his methods to avoid being traced. On October 14, 2004, Lee was convicted of the rape and murder of Charlotte Murray Pace, on May 31, 2002. Pace was a graduate student at Louisiana State University, and her murder had shaken the entire community. Lee was sentenced to death by lethal injection. On January 16, 2008, the state Supreme Court upheld the murder conviction and death sentence. Lee was placed on death row at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola. During the manhunt, John Walsh, host of America's Most Wanted, featured the Baton Rouge Serial Killer as number 3 on his list of top 10 fugitives of 2002. In addition to the DeSoto and Pace murders, DNA linked Lee to 5 other killings. They were Randy Mabrewer, Gina Green, Pam Keenamore, Trinacia Colomb, and Carrie Yoder, all killed between 1998 and 2003. The press suggested that Lee might be responsible for other unsolved murders in the area, but police lacked the DNA evidence to prove these connections. After Lee's arrest, it was discovered that another serial killer, Sean Vincent Gillis, was also active in the Baton Rouge area at the same time as Lee. This further complicated the investigation and explained why there were many murders that could not be attributed to Lee. In early 2003, an urban legend began to spread that Lee was using a recording of a baby crying to lure victims to open their doors. The Baton Rouge Police Department quickly denied that this information had originated from their office. Fueling this rumor were the Season 3 episodes of the TV series Criminal Minds, titled Children of the Dark and Tabula Rasa. Lee and the crying baby rumor were mentioned in both episodes. Snopes, the fact-checking website, reported on this urban legend and confirmed that it was just a baseless rumor. However, the rumor had become so widespread that many people believed it to be true. Lee spent his final years on death row at Angola. He filed multiple appeals but was unsuccessful. During this time, he wrote many letters, some of which may have been confessions to other crimes. However, investigators faced a challenge in determining the accuracy of these confessions. With his low IQ and potential influence from other factors, determining whether Lee was telling the truth became extremely difficult. On November 21, 2018, Lee's son, Derrick, then 19, was arrested for negligent homicide for accidentally shooting and killing 16-year-old Valenti Brooks in Jackson, Louisiana. The shooting had occurred 8 days earlier at Lee's home. In June 2019, Derrick was convicted of negligent homicide accessory to attempted robbery and obstruction of justice. He was released from jail 2 months later in August because most of his original sentence had been suspended. This illustrates how the cycle of violence can be passed from one generation to the next, even without direct contact between father and son. On January 21, 2016, after years on death row, Derrick Todd Lee died of heart disease in a Louisiana hospital. He had been transferred there for treatment from the Louisiana State Penitentiary, where he was awaiting execution. In the last 24 hours of his life, Lee spent his final moments in silence. Unlike many death row inmates, he did not have the chance to give a final statement or have a last meal of his choice as he died of natural causes. Lee's death brought a sense of relief to the families of his victims. Although they did not get to witness the execution as they had wished, his passing marked the end of a dark chapter in their history. The community's reaction to Lee's death was varied. Some felt that justice had been served, while others regretted that he did not have to face the death penalty as he had been sentenced. Today, the Derrick Todd Lee case is still remembered as one of the most shocking serial killer cases in Louisiana. The mistakes made during the investigation led to changes in how police approach similar cases. The use of DNA analysis to determine racial ancestry has become a standard tool in criminal investigations. However, this case also highlighted the biases that can affect the investigative process. The families of the victims continue with their lives, but the wounds that Lee inflicted will never fully heal. They have become strong advocates for victims of violent crime and have worked to ensure that such tragedies do not happen to other families. Diane Alexander. The sole survivor has become a symbol of resilience and hope. Although she endured a brutal attack, she found the strength to move on with her life and help others in similar situations. This case also led to improvements in victim support systems and increased training for law enforcement officers on how to handle sexual assault and serial murder cases. The story of Derrick Todd Lee is a reminder of the brutality that humans can inflict on one another, but it is also a testament to the resilience of survivors and the determination of those who seek justice. Although Lee has passed away, the lessons from this case will continue to influence how we approach criminal investigations and support victims for years to come. With the death of Derrick Todd Lee, a dark chapter has closed, but the memory of the innocent victims he took will forever be remembered. They are not just statistics in a crime file, but real people with dreams, hopes, and loved ones who miss them every day. Crime never disappears. It only hides waiting for someone brave enough to uncover the truth beneath the lies. What do you think really happened in this case? Leave a comment below and share your perspective. Sometimes the sharpest insight comes from the quietest observer. If you found this video thought-provoking, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn